Hello, this is Professor Zafari, and this is the second video in which we are continuing our discussion of the modern Middle East. In the previous discussion, we talked about the Ottoman Empire, and we talked about the collision course between Europe and the Middle East. So if we remind ourselves of this map, that in 1914 the Ottoman Empire was still in an alliance with the German and Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is not a new alliance, this is one that had been going on for a couple of centuries, but this alliance plays a major role in the destruction of the Ottoman Empire because the Ottomans honor their alliance and join into World War I. Even before World War I, however, several provinces of the Ottoman Empire had been seeking independence. So as we can see here, between 1878 to 1912, we have a series of revolts of people in the Balkan region who are fighting for independence. This is a picture of the last Ottoman Sultan who's leaving the country at the official end of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. Another factor that contributes to the end of the Ottoman Empire are the Arab revolts. In addition to people from the Balkan region, we have Arabs who want independence from Ottoman rule. And as Britain and France are very much enemies of the Ottomans by this time, the British in particular realize that they have an ally with these Arabs who want independence from the Ottomans. So the British form an alliance with an Arab family. And this is the family that had been the rulers of Mecca. They were like, let's say, the mayors who had been in charge of maintaining the holy sites. And so the British form an alliance with them to help them lead a revolt against the Ottomans. They send troops and arms to aid the Arabs to fight against the Ottoman Turks. And this then is the story that has been made famous in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. So let's take a quick look at who this figure, Lawrence of Arabia, was and his influence in the Middle East.
Through his friendship with Dahum and other Arabs working at the Karkamish site, Lawrence learned about the deep resentment they felt towards the Turks who governed them. For 4 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had ruled the Middle East, stretching Turkish influence from Constantinople to Mecca. But the empire was weakening. Turkey was now the sick man of Europe. Britain, France, and Russia were preparing to move in if the empire collapsed. That now seemed a real possibility. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Arabs were still a disparate people. Their main focus was the religious capital Mecca and the family of the Grand Sharif Hussein bin Ali that claimed direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Hussein bin Ali was considering a revolt against Turkish rule. He dreamed of founding an Arab nation, bringing together the thousands of tribes and principalities under a single government.
The Arabs looked to be the rulers of themselves instead of the Turks. The Arabs wanted their independence and their unity. That was the short thing of the revolt.
It was about creating a single nation, a single state, that would be independent, that would be powerful, economically and militarily, and play its role on the international stage.
Hussein knew that a group of Arab intellectuals in Damascus had formed a secret society pledged to fight for Arab independence. He sent 2 of his sons, Abdullah and Faisal, to measure the political mood among the Turks and to test Arab support for a revolt. The Turkish army controlled the region and cracked down hard on any hint of rebellion. The posting had landed him in a strategically vital part of the British Empire. Egypt gave the British control over their interests in the Near and Far East. It overlooked the Suez Canal and the precious land routes to India, and it gave them access to the great new resource, oil. Lawrence became involved in gathering intelligence about the possible Arab revolt. He interviewed prisoners and dissidents, ran agents, and helped to sponsor the idea of Arab insurrection. The British War Office saw that an Arab uprising could potentially destabilize the Turkish enemy. Lawrence's role gradually became more political. Lawrence was sent to find out if the Arab leaders felt the revolt had a future. It would be a dangerous expedition. He was heading into some of the fiercest desert in the world, and there was a real threat of attack by bandits or capture by the Turks.
They were short of funds, short of arms. The leadership was not happy with the whole situation. So many Arab officers actually started to desert and leave the camp of Sharif Hussein. So when Lawrence appeared on the scene, everybody felt that perhaps this stranger could do something to break this deadlock.
Faisal and his men explained why they thought the revolt was failing.
He was deeply discouraged. His men were tired. He had lost many of them. They were in every way ill-equipped. Little flour and rice, few rifles, insufficient ammunition, no technical help, no information. I said that my coming was expressly to learn what they lacked and to report it.
They accepted Lawrence as an officer representing a power, an ally, who could provide the revolt with weaponry and funds. They respected him because he represented the British government, no more or less.
Lawrence would begin his work with Faisal as liaison officer attached to the Arab forces. He began to draw up a shopping list of Arab requests.
Rifles, 2,000. Ammunition, 100 boxes. Dynamite, money, £16,000. Tents, socks, 2 pairs. Field glasses, if possible. Rope, candles, Lewis guns, cigarettes, 6,000. Chinese silk, camel saddles.
The revolt was on its feet again. But British support for the Arabs was not popular with all her allies. France sent her ambassador, Georges Picot, for urgent meetings with the British government. France had always wanted a colony in the East. They claimed they had shaped Syria since the Crusades and argued that Syria was as good as French territory. They feared that if the Arab revolt succeeded, their claim might be threatened. So they suggested a secret deal with the British, dividing Arabia between them. Before the war had even been won, the British promise of Arab independence was critically undermined. For now, Lawrence knew nothing of the backroom deals. He was spending most of his time with Faisal in the desert. Faisal suggested that if Lawrence was to live with the Arabs, he should dress like an Arab. It would help the tribes know how to respond to him. Lawrence and the Arabs would become a crucial part of the war in the desert.
So it is this story of the British alliance with the Arabs that helped overthrow the Ottoman Empire. We can see then that the British are directly influencing the future of the Middle East, and as we heard just briefly, France was already getting quite involved in Syria and wanting to stake their claims on these regions. The secret meetings between Sykes from Britain and Picot from France will ultimately result in the map of the Middle East being drawn as we see it now. Britain and France, and to a lesser extent Italy and Spain, will carve up North Africa and the Middle East between them. It will be until the middle of the 20th century that these regions gain their independence. You can see marked here that it's not until 1951 that Libya wins its independence from Italy. Algeria will have the bloodiest and most deaths in any of the revolutions in the Middle East, and it will not gain its independence until 1962. But there's another significant piece to this British-Arab alliance that was created in order to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. There was a third party that was part of the alliance, and that was the Wahhabi movement. So let's take a little detour and go into more depth about what the Wahhabi movement was all about. A man named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is responsible for starting this movement. He lived in the 1700s, in the 18th century, and his argument was that the reason that Europe had surpassed the Middle East in technology and military power is that Muslims had gone wrong by straying from the straight path of Islam. So he was arguing that it was a punishment from God, that God was no longer on the Muslim side, and in order for Muslims to regain their strength and their superior power, they had to return to the one true religion. For Abdul Wahhab and his followers, he saw the Ottomans as, quote, the decorous, arty, tobacco-smoking, hashish-imbibing, drum-pounding Egyptian and Ottoman nobility who traveled across Arabia to pray at Mecca. So he looked down upon the Ottomans. He did not think that they were true Muslims, and he argued that as they were not true Muslims, he could call them heretics. So in Abdul Wahhab's view, there is a very strict idea of who is a true Muslim, and anything outside of this he denounced and he said was forbidden by God. He said that it was only the Arabs who were the true Muslims and who knew Islam correctly. So what this essentially says is that all of the Muslims outside of Arabia proper don't know what they're talking about. He rejected all of the scholars who for centuries had agreed to disagree. He said all of these different schools of thought are completely invalid. He said scholars and jurists are heretics, and even went so far to call some of them devils or the spawn of Satan. As we know by now, this is not Islamic. Islam specifically says that it is a sin to judge someone else's faith. It is also not allowed to assert oneself in a position of judgment over others. That's for God alone. But this was irrelevant to Abdul Wahhab. He consistently ignored these teachings, and interestingly, he had absolutely no degrees to back up his authority. What's interesting about him is that his father and his brother both were scholars. They were both religious scholars, quite well respected. And Abdul Wahhab actually never graduated the equivalent of college with a bachelor's degree. He flunked out. His father pulled some strings, got him back into college, but he never quite made it. And as Abdul Wahhab started spreading all of these fanatical ideas, his brother was his biggest critic, saying, "What the hell are you talking about?" And eventually Abdul Wahhab's refusal to step down and to refute what he was saying got him kicked out of his society. He was ostracized, he was asked to leave because he refused to back down from these ideas. So his teachings really don't have any basis in Scripture, and he was very widely regarded as a fanatic, as somebody with no basis, as somebody with no real education by the people of his time. But his views did take hold, and unfortunately he's not the only one who tends to take religion in this kind of manner. We call this a puritanical approach to religion. And the definition of puritanical is practicing or affecting strict religious or moral behavior. And I would add to this, I would not say it's strict religious or moral behavior. It's a very subjective religious or moral behavior. And it says, I'm the only one right. You either agree with me or you are wrong. And this then is where he takes this idea of calling people heretics. And he argues that therefore he can legitimately kill them because they are corrupting the religion. This is very similar to the Inquisition that goes through Europe, the Roman Inquisition, the French Inquisition, and the famous Spanish Inquisition. And what the Christians were doing, the Catholics were doing during those Inquisitions, is anyone who did not hold views that were exactly like theirs were tried, which meant they were tortured until they recanted, and killed. So of course that included Muslims, of course that included Jews, and it also included fellow Christians who did not necessarily hold the same exact teachings as the Catholic Church. So we have an identical phenomenon going here, a puritanical belief, you are with me or you are wrong. And he, in particular, Abdul Wahhab and his followers took offense against Shia. They considered all Shia Muslims heretics and killed them. They considered Sufis heretics. They considered Muslims who followed philosophy and believed in teachings that reason is a legitimate source of truth to also be heretics, and wanted to rid and purify Islam of all of these corruptions by killing these Muslims. In the next century, even far after Abdul Wahhab's death, his ideas are going to surface again. This movement also began to develop very hostile views against non-Muslims as well. They felt that non-Muslims could not be an ally of Muslims. So there was a very strong stance taken, and they developed this hostility. Wahhabism has become relevant to us in the 21st century, unfortunately, because some of Al-Qaeda's views taken from by Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and other leaders of Al-Qaeda, they've taken directly from these Wahhabi views to support their agenda of killing people who disagree with them and killing non-Muslim powers that interfere, as they see it, with their religious practice. So these ideas of the Wahhabis are illegitimate, as scholars have all argued, and they're a significant minority. There are very small people, a number of people who hold these views, but unfortunately they are people who use these views to inflict a lot of violence and cruelty. Another aspect of Wahhabism that's relevant to us today is a connection between ISIS. There's an article in the Huffington Post in which scholars argue there's a connection between the Wahhabis' ideas and ISIS's ideas. So let's take a look at this view. The connections or similarities between the views of ISIS and the views of Wahhabism is that both movements call for a unified Islamic state with power consolidated in one ruler. Neither movement supports democracy, neither movement wants to see any type of representative government. They want to see one ruler. ISIS specifically calls for having a caliph, similar to how the Islamic Empire had in previous centuries. Both groups uphold only one puritanical view of Islam. As you could hear in the article, ISIS is very much against Shia Muslims, as was the Wahhabi movement. Both ISIS and the Wahhabis condemn fellow Muslims, and they justify killing fellow Muslims, especially Shia and others, and both aim to bring people they've conquered into submission, and they use fear in order to do that. So to return to our previous topic about the Arab revolts, what results is that the British form an alliance with Arabs who want to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, in the region of the Arabian Peninsula, we have this growing Wahhabi movement, and this growing Wahhabi movement is already killing people, has already created an ideology in which they are espousing you are either with us or against us. And so the Arabs ask the Wahhabis to join this alliance. So we have a three-way alliance now between the British, between these Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula, who will eventually be from the Saud tribe, and from the Wahhabi movement. So ultimately they will win. They will overthrow the Ottoman Empire, and the British will go back on their word to give the Saud tribe all of the region that they had wanted, and they'll give them instead a piece of the Arabian Peninsula, and of course the Saud family will then name it the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And now the British will no longer be as directly involved in Saudi Arabia, but we still have an alliance between the rulers, the Saud tribe, and the Wahhabi movement. And so this explains the connections between Wahhabism and Saudi Arabia. It helps explain why some of these radical views still persist. It helps explain why some of the 9/11 hijackers held these Wahhabi views and were from Saudi Arabia. So these political influences, this puritanical group of Wahhabism has still left a significant impact that we're dealing with today. And a little bit of this problem is also compounded by the fact that groups like ISIS and groups like Al-Qaeda, and now all of these splinter groups that espouse really puritanical and fanatical views, they don't have a clear ideology. So the problem becomes that much more complex when they themselves don't have a clear view that we can understand. So we'll stop here and continue our discussion in the next video.